the technical services lead at Syncari. I'm going to be your point of contact moving forward for anything SDK or custom action related. And let's quickly dive into it. So basically, what Syncari SDK is that it enables you to create a custom synapse that is equal to our existing native offering and to expand our portfolio of connectors. The SDK is built using Python. Currently, this is the only language we support. We have potentially in the works support for some other languages, but at this time, Python is the only language we support. And the synapses itself, once approved, are being hosted by us. So once you develop a synapse, you test it, you import it inside the Syncari application. We will then provide the hosting for that connector, so you don't have to handle any of that on your side. And we'll also go later through the process of submitting the synapse once it's fully developed. And as I mentioned, we will briefly touch on the custom actions. So basically, custom synapses can be almost identical to their native counterparts. I say almost because currently, in our first iteration of our SDK, we will always ask our partners, especially ones using our SDK right now, to always reach out to us in cases where they're going to be implementing more complex systems. There's two reasons behind it. One is it's possible that we already have this in our roadmap, and we obviously don't want our partners to waste time on something that we plan to build or are perhaps already building. And currently, there are some limitations in terms of authentication methods, which we'll address a little bit later. Currently, it's possible to almost, let's say, 90% mimic one-to-one what a native synapse can do, but there are some nuances here and there. So always, if there's going to be any confusion, you always feel free to reach out to us, just so we make sure that you're not going to dive into a project that potentially is going to be either cumbersome or maybe it'll have some hurdles along the way. But when it comes to custom actions, the main difference between the synapse and the custom action is that custom actions should be always used where you don't require a unified data model. And what we mean by that is where you don't need data to be synced between your third-party system and Syncari and then unified with data from other systems. This is a potential use case for a custom action. And like, for example, you can think of our custom, so our native Slack synapse has an action that you can send a Slack notification. So that would be, for example, a good use case for a custom action where you basically just need to send some payload with some data that is being triggered inside the Syncari pipeline. Also, any types of things. So if you're going to be building a custom synapse, for example, for a marketing automation tool, and that tool supports any functions, things like adding to a campaign, removing from a list, adding to a list, those actions cannot be currently added inside the custom synapse. Custom synapse supports only CRUD operations. So if there's anything beyond the scope of the synchronization of data, custom actions would come into play. So basically, you can leverage custom actions on its own, just for any actions you'd like to perform. One common use case that our partners use is, for example, they would like to check if the email address is valid or not using a service like Kickbox or Neverbounce. And then basically they use custom action inside their contact pipeline or lead pipeline, for example. But also it's also possible to leverage them in a case where you're building a synapse for a more complex system using different functions, and then you can augment those functions with custom actions to fully support as much of the API as possible within Syncari. So to sum up, it really comes down to the custom actions can be always leveraged inside pipelines where you don't require the custom action to know if a contact exists in between different systems. It's really meant to be used to send and receive data from a system, and then building a synapse wherever you want data to be synced and Syncari to understand and know which contacts are in the other system, and also be able to unify them together to hold this golden record on all sides. And also, please, during my presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt if maybe something will not be clear.
Moving on.
This is an example of a skeleton structure of our custom Synapse. It includes the execute method, which is the entry point for our system to call the Synapse class, and then obviously the Synapse class itself. And then we have all of the methods that we currently support. We actually just updated our SDK, which is not yet reflected in our documentation and also not this presentation because it was just added. We're also going to support now the refresh of tokens and fetching the tokens for Auth. So this is also already possible. We just need to update our documentation. But just to quickly sum up the structure of the Synapse class, we first have our Synapse info method, which provides an object that describes the Synapse itself to our system. Those include name, images, type of Synapse, and mainly authentications. So you can then decide, set which authentication type the Synapse will be using. And also when using webhooks, it's possible to provide fields for webhook identifiers so that they can be used then in methods below. Then there is the test method, which is used for testing the connection. I'll show you later on how the test method is actually used within the UI, where we call it when uploading the Synapse, and also when adding the Synapse itself once approved. Then describe method is used for passing the schema along to Syncari from the third-party system. So here we have the option of either hard coding the schema inside the main .py file, or inside this describe method, you can actually call it. If the third-party system supports fetching the schema dynamically, you can then fetch it inside this method dynamically and pass it along, fit it inside our model. Obviously, whenever possible, we always recommend to fetch schema dynamically, because then users will have the option inside our application to refresh the schema on the fly without you needing to change any of the hard-coded cases. But obviously, it's also possible to hard code, especially maybe for like the MVPs or version ones. It's maybe a little bit faster and easier to hard code, and then you can revisit this in later iterations of the custom Synapse. And so those three are methods that are always required, because those methods really, regardless of the Synapse that you'll build, those will always be present. So Synapse info, test, and describe. And then we have our CRUD operations and the get by ID. So those are like the core methods that will allow you to create this sync between third-party system and Syncari. The most important and also the most complex method is going to be the read method. This method is basically running when Syncari pipelines are running. So this will always run either on the first iteration when we're resyncing the systems, but also every minute when we're checking for any future updates. Then get by ID is being just used for testing and for when we're doing the trying to fetch reference data for reference fields. That is basically just it. The method itself will just receive a list of IDs, and then you have the option to perform the get method. However, it's possible to do it in the third-party systems. And the other methods will basically work the same way as the get by ID. So get by ID, create, update, delete, all receive a list of IDs and select record entities that they can be called then to either create, update, delete, or fetch a single record inside a third-party system. And then the last but not least, two methods are for processing webhooks. First is the extract webhook identifier. So we will generate an endpoint for each Synapse, and the extract webhook identifier is meant to be used to make sure that each account is using only correct data and processing correct data. So the way we do this is that in the Synapse info, you can define a field inside the UI to act as a webhook identifier. The user then adds a value that the payloads will provide. And then this method will basically check against get value so that we make sure that each user will get only correct payloads processed. And then obviously process webhook works a little bit similar, like either get by ID or read methods, where all the correctly sent payload data to this account will be processed and then basically returned as records and pushed through the pipeline for each entity. And here is an example of a dummy method. So here's an example of a get by ID. And this is like a little bit of a pseudo code, but basically, as I was saying, is the method will receive a sync request, and then in this example case, we would check if the entity name inside the sync request is user, and then basically iterate over those user and basically fetch user data, and then add them into a list or array of records, which is a record model of Syncari, to then pass back to the system itself. And so like for the CRUD operations, this is a very similar structure. Obviously, when posting data, you need to add the body payload of the data that you get from the sync request. But yeah, other methods are very similar to this one, besides obviously the read method, which involves a little bit more work, especially in terms of maintaining the watermark object and making sure that pagination, everything is working accordingly. And currently, Syncari supports, as I mentioned before, we don't support yet all of the authentication methods, but we do support now the most commonly used ones. So basic token, username, password, API key, or OAuth. So this OAuth is a recent addition. We currently support the username password iteration. So when you have OAuth with username, password, client ID, and secret, that is currently supported. Other flavors of OAuth are currently not yet supported, but we're working towards and hope that we'll add more supports in the coming days. And so if the third-party system has a different authentication method, also if there's like a SOAP-based API that currently wouldn't be supported, obviously, if you have a system or will have a use case that will be out of the current technical scope of our SDK, always feel free to let us know, and we'll check if there's a workaround or potentially if we have maybe something in our roadmap to support that in the future. As I was discussing previously a little bit about our describe method, here's an example of a Syncari schema. So this is just an example of an arbitrary customer entity and how the schema would look based on our model. So as mentioned before, it's either possible to hard code this inside the file itself, or if you're going to be fetching it live, you would then have to make sure that this is fitted in the similar, basically in the same way, dynamically inside the method itself. So, but really, I would emphasize here that especially when it comes to schema and to maybe allow for a little bit more rapid development, maybe I would strongly recommend to, especially in the first version, you could maybe for the first few synapses, you can get away with hard coding this, just so there's fewer moving parts. But obviously, long term is always better to have the dynamically generated ones, as they allow for a little bit more better user experience. And now on how to so once you've created the custom synapse and you want to basically send it for approval to our engineering team. So inside the Synapse Studio, inside the Syncari application, on your upper right corner, there is a drop-down menu. It's going to say Synapse Library, and if you click it, you basically can navigate to the custom synapses. And there on the right-hand bar, you can create a new synapse, and that will take you to a new, basically, import wizard for the custom synapse. You can add your name, and it will generate the API name, and then you have to add your main file. So this is main.py file where all the logic of the synapse lives, and you need to add the requirements.txt file. In the requirements.txt file, you would only need to provide all the Python models you would use. If you're using only the native models and our SDK, then you just have to write our SDK in. But if you're using any other libraries, anything else that's not native or SDK, then you would just list it inside the requirements file so that our system knows that they need to load it as well. Once that is done, you can click on the Create Custom Synapse. That process might take somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes because it will deploy your Synapse to our cloud. And once that is done, it will allow you to test the authentication method of your Synapse. This step is not required, but it's obviously very recommended to use it because it's also one more step for you to see if you did if maybe something went wrong or the authentication is working as expected. And once that is done, the last step is submitting the Synapse for review, and it's gonna basically stay in your Synapse Studio view as a pending for approval. There's gonna be an icon basically that's gonna signal that the Synapse is not yet been approved. Now, the approval process itself, once you put the Synapse for approval, our customer experience team will receive a Zendesk ticket, and we will create a ticket for our engineering team. For the first sets of synapses, our engineering team will take up to 1 week to review the code. They'll be reviewing mainly for malware and any basically logic issues that may be implemented that could cause problems for our systems. But we expect this approval time to get gradually significantly lower. We just want to give ourselves a little bit more time, especially for the first synapses that are going to be released by our partners, that we can properly make sure that everybody's aligned and the synapses will be working. But we hope that, in the following months, we'll be able to reduce this significantly and be able to have a quicker turnaround on this. And once our engineering team approves the Synapse, you'll be notified by somebody on our customer experience side, and then we'll work together to make sure that the Synapse is working. We'll provide you guidance that we can make end-to-end tests, preferably in a sandbox environment, so that we can all make sure that any functions you implemented in the custom Synapse is actually working to your expectations. And once the Synapse is approved, it will be automatically shared across the organization. This is currently a default setting that cannot be changed, but we're planning to add 2 additional sharing options, which is to make it global, so that if you're going to publish a custom Synapse and you want to make it global, you'll be able to basically set that any user of Syncari, regardless of the organization, will have access to it. And also an option to just share with specific set of instances across different organizations. So this is hopefully going to come in the next few months to give a little bit more flexibility in terms of sharing the custom Synapse. And that is all on my end so far. And now, if anybody has any questions, please let me know.